OK, our top story this hour, and today the Prime Minister will attempt to bring the Russian President Vladimir Putin back from the brink of war.
Downing Street says Moscow could be planning to invade Ukraine at any moment. American officials saying attacks likely within the next 48 hours, and Western nations have threatened Moscow with sanctions in the event of further incursions into Eastern Europe.
Well, here to give us the latest is Mark White, our Home and Security Editor. Look, we've been talking for weeks now about what's going on that border, and it certainly feels as though the rhetoric, at least, is really ramping up.
Yeah, it's been getting increasingly pessimistic, and now, of course, we're hearing from Western nations, particularly London and Washington, that Wednesday is a key date as far as they're concerned. Their intelligence analysis of the battlefield effectively over there shows them that the placement of these Russian forces would be at the optimum point to be able to move in and to invade. I have to say I'm still not convinced it will happen. I know that later this hour you're going to be interviewing the former Chief of the General Staff, General Lord Dannatt. He said to me last week he believed that diplomacy will win through, and, you know, I think he's right. It would be a huge calculation by Vladimir Putin to put his forces in there, because whatever people might be saying about Ukrainian armed forces not matching up to Russia, they are still very significant. 200,000 standing army, 150,000 reservists, and there are pictures all over the papers today showing civilians who are training to use firearms as well, including an 80-year-old woman. You know, if Russia comes in, it will be no easy win for them at all.
But it would be no easy situation for Vladimir Putin to step back, wind his neck in a bit. What's going to save face for him?
I'm not convinced of that. On both sides, you've got the West and Western countries, I say, in particular the UK and the US, talking about this conflict that is now inevitable. If it doesn't happen, they can turn around and say, well, look at the amazing diplomacy and the hard-nosed way in which we have dealt with Russia that has brought them back from the brink. Likewise, if Vladimir Putin doesn't go in, he says, well, look, this is exactly the propaganda I was telling you about. I've been telling you for months. I have no intention of doing anything else other than carrying out exercises here on the border, and that's exactly what we've done.
It is a diplomatic minefield, if you forgive the analogy, though. I mean, we saw Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, getting into hot water yesterday in an interview he gave to The Times, describing the situation as having the whiff of Munich, the sort of allegation of appeasement to Russia. And, of course, it would be so easy, wouldn't it, to make a misstep at this point and actually be, as the Ukrainians see it, fanning the flames.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it is a very dangerous situation, and I don't in any of this analysis seek to undermine that standpoint. The trouble is, of course, with these very tense situations, brinksmanship, is that they can sometimes take on a momentum of their own. And that, I think, is the real worry here, that there is a misstep, a miscalculation that starts off a conflict that then intensifies and drags other European NATO allies into it, because make no mistake, if there was a conflict in Ukraine of any significance, then their neighbours, these NATO countries that we have sworn to support.
Let's just take a look at a map here, and we'll just have a look and see who the neighbours actually are and what the repercussions may well be.
Yeah, well, you can see, obviously, that that is Germany, Romania, Poland, Ukraine itself, right on the border with Russia. But there are 14 Eastern European countries that joined NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, Russia has said, look, you know, although it was never put in writing, there was a verbal agreement that there would not be an eastward expansion of NATO after the fall of the Soviet Empire. 14 countries have joined. They absolutely don't want to see a 15th in Ukraine joining. As far as the UK, the US and other NATO allies are concerned, well, they are not going to move in and help Ukraine directly. They have been sending arms and troops to help train Ukraine's forces in the use of the likes of anti-tank missiles. But if conflict breaks out, those troops will be very speedily withdrawn, and it'll be up to Ukraine to defend itself, sadly.
Mark, we'd like to bring in who you just referred to earlier, General Lord Richard Dannatt, who's been listening to what you've had to say. Lord Dannatt, a very good morning to you.
Morning.
This situation, Mark was saying last week when he spoke to you, didn't believe there would be conflict, a further incursion. Are you still of that mind?
Well, yes, good morning. I am still of that mind. I agree that on the one hand, you could say that the signs don't look encouraging, and it's a proven fact through intelligence that's been well sourced that the Russian armed forces have now built their capability up, not just with combat troops, but with combat enablers as well, so that there is no doubt that they have the overall capability to launch an attack. But whether they do or don't still relies on the decision, and that decision will be taken by Vladimir Putin. So it makes complete sense that the war of words, the diplomacy, continues. And I think Vladimir Putin is weighing up a lot of things very carefully in his mind, one of which Mark Wright's already referred to, and that is that the Ukrainian armed forces themselves are not inconsiderable, in number well over 200,000, in capability much more capable, much more useful than they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. And they will give good account for themselves. And I think the other thing just to bear in mind as far as war and conflict is concerned, there are several components of conflict. There is the physical component, the tanks and the guns, and we know that the Russians have got a lot of those. Then there's the moral component, which actually is the will to fight and the will to win. And there's no doubt that the Ukrainians love their country passionately and will fight for their country. And the third element is what we call the conceptual element. And actually, right is on their side. They have the absolute right to defend their sovereignty. And we have the right to support them in defending that sovereignty. So Vladimir Putin has got a lot to weigh up. And if I read other media reports correctly this morning, I think later this morning on your programme, you're going to have the Ukrainian ambassador. And he has begun to say something very helpful, which is that Ukraine may not pursue its application to join NATO. And of course, it would not be alone in not joining NATO. Sweden, Finland, for example, are not NATO members. So Ukraine could find a way out in a diplomatic sense by not pursuing at this stage its application to join NATO.
And how harmful would that be? I mean, you say it'd be very helpful, certainly in, staving off the threat of war at the moment, immediate threat. But the long-term message, surely, then, to Putin is that if he flexes his muscles, builds up troops, bullies the West, then eventually he gets what he wants, which is to stop a sovereign nation increasing their defences.
Yes, you can argue that, but I think you've got to look at it again from Mr. Putin's point of view and from the point of view of a lot of Russian people. Ukraine, in many Russians' minds, is part of Greater Russia. Nikita Khrushchev, that well-known former Soviet leader, he was from Ukraine. So Ukraine has a very special place in Russian people's minds. Now, on that basis, Ukraine stands apart from other former Soviet dominated countries that became independent after the end of the Cold War. And they became independent. They chose to join the EU. They chose to join the Partnership for Peace programme and indeed NATO, because they were only communist as a result of the end of the Second World War. The conquest by the Red Army in 1943, 44 and 45 made those countries communist. Ukraine is different. Many Russians feel that Ukraine is part of Greater Russia. So it puts itself into a very different category. And Belarus, of course, is the same. But no question of Belarus being anything other than in the Russian sphere. So the best position for Ukraine is for Ukraine to be independent, to be neutral. Ukraine does not want to be part of any formal Russian alliance. And if it was to give up its claim, its wish, its apparent wish to join NATO, it would take a lot of the sting out of this. We can go on being very friendly with Ukraine. We can support Ukraine. We can support Ukraine in its right to be independent and to be sovereign. I think that's a very honourable position. And that is a very helpful formula for de-escalating this situation.
General, from your army experience, if Russia was to mount an assault, How would it go about it? What would it do? Would it be by air? Would it be sea barrage? Would it be missiles? Would it be incursion with tanks and soldiers? How would you see it happening?
Well, if there's a serious intent to make a major invasion of Ukraine, then all those things that you've mentioned will be synchronized into one coordinated set of action. I'm not quite sure how many armored divisions that they've got in Belarus, but I would certainly strike for Kiev from Belarus, and I would use all the forces available to them. And they may well be successful in the short term, but go back to what I said before. Over 200,000 members of the Ukrainian armed forces, Ukrainian civilian militia are learning to use weapons, and the determination of the Ukrainians to be sovereign and to be independent. And I think it's one thing for the Russians to believe that a lightning attack may be able to enable them to move significantly into many parts of Ukraine. But what then? Are they going to stay and fight some kind of bloody insurgency? And also the whole action of moving in will incur a lot of casualties on Russian forces, not to mention on Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian infrastructure. And the whole opprobrium of the rest of the civilized world will fall upon Russia. Frankly, this kind of bloodshed and saber rattling is stuff of the 18th, 19th and mid-20th century. It's not stuff of the 21st century. If Vladimir Putin does this, he should be hanging his head in shame that he has brought old-fashioned bloody war into Europe, frankly, 50, 100 years after it was last thinkable. It is unacceptable, and he really needs to consider all these things and find a diplomatic way out where he can be satisfied that Ukraine is not going to join NATO at this stage. He can declare success for his major exercise and operations and return his troops to barracks and set about trying to rebuild a decent relationship with the West. And I think that's what a lot of people would like to see. That's what we should be moving towards. Diplomacy and dialogue, much better than fighting, which will be bloody and ultimately futile.
Well, that was the former head of the British Army, General Lord Richard Dannatt, you were listening to there, who, like Mark White, doesn't feel that an incursion will happen this week. Well, let's get the view now live from Moscow from Sergei Markov. He's a former spokesman for Putin. You'll have heard the words there from the former head of the British Army. Do you agree? Do you think that a diplomatic solution is the more likely outcome at this stage?
I think the diplomatic solution is possible, but only if Western countries, specifically United States of America, who control Ukrainian government, will be ready for such democratic solution and will be ready to resolve specific problem. The main problem is that Kiev regime not implementing Minsk agreement and continue to shell every night the cities of Donetsk and Lugansk and other cities of Donbas region. I myself been on the conference in Donetsk and wake up 3 nights, every night in the deep night because of shelling, artillery shelling of Ukrainian army. Believe me, this it's not pleasant. It continues 7 years, and United States and European Union and Great Britain fully ignore that Kiev regime every day, every night, more specifically, violate this peace agreement and don't want to implement Minsk agreement, which is a political, diplomatic solution of the crisis with Donbas separatists. It's number one. Secondly, is democratization of Ukraine. The key problem that to say this regime in Ukraine is democratic, it's a wicked job. It's absolutely it's a repressive regime. It's a regime which have thousands of political prisoners who kill thousands of political opponents. So this
I must interrupt you.
Replaced by democratically elected.
OK, well, I mean, a lot of people would say the same about Russia, Sergei, if I may interrupt you, because we've only got limited time. I mean, a lot of people would say that Russia's not a democratic country, and that's no reason for us to go to war. When you talk about the Minsk agreement, is that where you see then that there needs to be more dialogue? And, of course, we're expecting Olaf Scholz from Germany to be meeting in Kiev and Moscow later today. You know, are these the kind of conversations that you think could be key to sorting this situation out?
Minsk agreement had been signed 7 years ago, and it had been proved by a decision of the highest top level United Nations Security Council, and it should be implemented. What Kiev repressive regime wants to do? He wants just to say that it's Minsk agreement, but totally change it. But this Minsk agreement means that separatists stay as they are. War is stopping, and nobody killing the people, and then some small negotiation between separatists and the government started. It's very easily. It's normal, classical solution of separatist case. But no, Kiev regime and United States behind it was only one, to by force, not to respect the right of these people. And also, when I'm talking about democracy and so on, it could be a lot of question about democracy, different countries, so on. But everybody agree that Vladimir Putin represent the policy of the majority of people in Russia. It's no doubt about this. And but it's absolutely not in Ukraine. Can you imagine, for example, that Russian language, which is a language for the 75% of the people in Ukraine, you can go to any big Ukrainian city and see what language they speak. Can you believe that these people voluntarily, democratically, can support prohibition of Russian language as official language? As the people in Great Britain would support prohibition of English language democratically? Of course not. Same in Ukraine. Ukraine has no democratic power. Ukraine has no democratic government. Ukraine has puppet repressive regime, which should be replaced by those governments which represent really Ukrainian people.
Mr. Marhov, thank you very much indeed. Sergei Marov, the former spokesperson for President Putin, thank you very much indeed for your time today. Mark White, our Home and Security editor on this. I mean, you heard the British point of view from General Lord Richard Dannatt about that, and then Sergei Marov there. Are you heartened in any way?
No. A lot of finger pointing, a lot of passions running high, clearly. You hear the Russian viewpoint there. They're very mistrustful, understandably, of NATO in the West. They don't want that sphere of influence encroaching ever closer to their borders. Let's just hope diplomacy wins out at the end of the day. That's certainly General Lord Dannatt's view, even a week on, as the language that's coming out of London and Washington is increasingly pessimistic.
Mark White, thank you very much indeed.